Howdy everyone. Alright, so this is the left wheel pant now in place and pretty much finished. I've got it completely trimmed. I've got everything cleaned up. The only couple of things I have left to do is I have to enlarge the holes for the actual screws, which are going to be the copper looking clecos. So these will be screws. There are 2 more here that will be screws, and there are 4 more on this back side. These 2 here will have to be enlarged for screws, and then those 2 back there are also screws. After those locations are drilled out to the proper size for the screws, they'll have to be countersunk for the countersunk head of the screw. And then these locations here, which attach the front half to the back half, these will be screws as well. But I think, I'll have to check. I think these are smaller. I think these are 8s, and I think these are 6s. But anyway, these will have to be drilled, and everything will have to be countersunk for the screws. I'm not going to do that yet. I'm going to wait until I get the other side done, and then I'm going to do all my final drilling and all my countersinking at once. The other thing is, when I get to that point, I'll film it. But underneath where these copper screw holes are going to be, all whatever that is, 2, 4, 6 of them, I have to put some reinforcing fiberglass on the inside to build up the thickness, just to reinforce and make those locations stronger. Those locations are what attach the actual pant to the gear leg. Those locations need to be beefed up, and you'll see in the coming videos as I work through it. If the pant doesn't fit exactly correct on the brackets that are underneath, if there's a gap, you have to fill in that gap. So it plays 2 roles. You fill in gaps, and you also want to reinforce those locations. Like I said, I'll get into that when I do the other side. So this is done, completely trimmed, completely fitted. All I need to do, like I said, is final size the holes and do the countersinking, and then put in my reinforcements. Like I said, I'm not going to do any of that until I get the other side done, and then I'll do both sides at the same time. So now that I've gone through this process, I'm going to walk you through it step by step as I do the other side. And again, there are plenty of ways to get this done. This is just my method, doing what I'm comfortable doing with the equipment that I have on hand. Plenty of ways to do it otherwise. Let me walk you through my way, and I'll talk to you guys here soon. Howdy everyone. Alrighty, so I am getting started on this right wheel pant. So one of the first things I see, again, I don't recall if I talked about this in a previous video or not, so I'll make it quick. I had to rebend my brake lines a little bit. Originally my brake lines were sticking out over top of the caliper here, and there was a little bit of interference when I was trying to fit the fairing. So I just rebent the lines to bring this loop closer to the axle and a little bit smaller, basically just moving it forward and making it a little bit smaller. And then I made this loop here a little bit bigger just to pull everything up and make sure that it was tight in so that it wouldn't interfere with the fairing. Again, you want to make sure that you have the line bent in such a way that there's no, I can't get my hand on here, so there's no binding with the caliper itself. You want the caliper to be able to move freely. So I had to do that. That was one of the first things I had to do. The instructions will talk about putting a spacer on the tire, just like you see here. I believe it's 1 inch in height. This one is a smidge bigger. It's like 1 inch and 1/16, inch and 1/8 at the most. You tape it to the top of the tire just like you see here. I think I've already talked about that I want my tires as big as they're going to be within the fairing. So I have these pumped up to like 40 psi, 45 psi, something like that, just so they're nice and big and firm. You can see I've got my bracket on. This can stay. It will probably come off a couple of times because it's going to ultimately need to be riveted to the fairing. But this is in place, and this is the bracket. When you have the airplane level, you want this edge here, this front edge of this bracket needs to be perpendicular to the longerons. So if your longerons are level, this front face of this bracket needs to be 90 degrees. With that at 90 degrees, don't know if this will show very well. The instructions also talk about you've got this line here between the flange of the fairing and the fairing itself. This is a molded in flange. It's roughly an inch deep. What I had done was measured an inch from this front face, and I've drawn a line at that location. This black line here, that's 1 inch from this front face. And again, that's talked about in the written instructions. This front face of the bracket needs to be in line literally with that line. So if this is at 90 degrees, you put your fairing on, you line this edge up, this ear here and this ear here with your 1 inch line on the fairing. You can see I've already started to rough cut. I've got this cut out. I've got the opening for the tire started. I've got my block in place. And I'm just trying to fit everything on so I can get the fairing up to this front edge here. So let me continue getting that figured out, and I'll come back here in a second. Okay, so I've got enough cut from the fairing that I can actually slide it up over the wheel and have it roughly located in place. So now that those rough cuts are done and I can actually get the fairing on and off, I went ahead and made sure that I've got my fuselage center line. All I had done was crawl up underneath the airplane and using different rivet lines, I dropped down a plumb bob and made a mark, and then I jumped out, did the same thing up on the forward side. The marks are probably about 3-4 feet apart, I guess. Dropped a plumb bob, made a mark, dropped a plumb bob, made a mark, connected the dots, so to speak, with my straight edge. That represents the center line of the aircraft. Then I used a large carpenter's framing square, lined it up on my mark and along the straight edge, and then the leg of the carpenter's square, I made a mark. Same thing on this side. I lined up the carpenter's square with the mark on from the plumb bob, laid one leg of the square on my straight edge, the other leg then comes out, and I made a mark. And then I went from the mark on the straight edge from the plumb bob to the mark that I just made using the square, and I'd connect those dots, and I extended that out to where these pieces of tape are. I made 3 marks on the pieces of tape, 36 inch, 37, and 38. So from this straight edge at a 90-degree angle coming straight out, I marked my 3 marks, which you probably won't be able to see because they're covered up, but this is 36, this is on 37, and then 38 is on this side. Same thing with the front. After I had the square and I made my mark, I took a long straight edge and continued that line across, and then at 36 inches, 37 inches, and 38 inches, I made marks. So then I've got my world famous blue bar, and I've got it lined up on the 37 inch marks. Now, the way that I came up with 37 inches was when I had done the other side, I had just guessed. So I took long pieces of tape this way in these two locations and just eyeballing the tire. I kind of came back and I put my long pieces of tape where I thought that extended center line might fall. Put a long piece of tape here. I did my measurements from center line and I came out, and then I did a bunch of marks. I did from 32 to 40 or something like that. 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40. A bunch of reference marks on both of these, measuring from the center line out. And then using my blue bar, I lined it up visually with the center line of the tire and roughly center line of the fairing. And that fell basically on the 37-inch mark. So I used 37 inches as my reference over there. I'm going to use 37 inches as my reference here. So now, with the bar on my 37-inch marks, I can get an aerial view, if you will, like this. And if I look at the center line of the tire and line that up with the edge of my reference bar, and I line up the trailing edge of the fairing with that edge of the bar, you can see in general that it is perfectly straight. So it is now perfectly in alignment with the fuselage. Again, I say it all the time, plenty of ways to get the job done, right? This is just my method dealing with what I've got available to me. So now that I've got all my references lined up down here on the ground and I've got my pole set up, and again, like I said, I've got the fairing cut out enough that I can actually get it on and off. I've come in here, and this is going to be completely useless because of the lighting, but I have the edge, the 2 feet of this bracket are lined up with that line within the fairing. And I've got it clamped in place so it can't move. So with the bracket lined up and it clamped to the reference line, I've got my reference line still for the center of the fairing, and it is lined up over top of my block, centered on the tire. All I needed to do at this point was take the trailing edge and figure out where it needs to be in alignment. That was easy to do, luckily, because I have this cutout here on the fairing to clear the leg. Fortunately, a cleco was the correct spacing I needed to put between the fairing cutout and the gear leg. With that cleco in place, that forced the fairing this way, and it got it perfectly in alignment. Again, you want your center line over top of the center of the tire. You want your bracket here, this internal bracket needs to be at 90 degrees. I checked that with the digital level. I put the forward edge, the front edge of those 2 ears, feet if you will, on my drawn reference line. Clamp those together. That gets clamped in place. And then again, it's just a matter of taking the trailing edge of the fairing and moving it around to get it in alignment. So now, the fairing is in alignment with this bracket and the front edge. It's in alignment with the center of the tire. I've got my blue straight edge on the 37-inch mark here. And then again, just visually, as best that I can, I can get that alignment that you see there down the center line of the tire, down the center line of the fairing, and then out the trailing edge of the fairing. So now at this point, I can go ahead and, like I have done before, I'll take a drill bit and I'll reach in here, and using the existing holes on this aluminum bracket, I'll mark the fairing. I'll go put the drill bit through the bracket holes and spin it to make the marks on the fairing. And then I'll take the fairing off and I'll drill it. And then I'll come back. I'll put my Cleco spacer back there, make sure that this is in alignment here, and make sure that this will fall back into place just like it is now with Clecos holding it instead of the clamps. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'll get these 4 holes drilled and I'll put this back together and see how it looks. All right, talk to you guys here shortly.